Good morning, everyone, or rather afternoon, wherever you may be located. Thank you for joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's joint Dr. Class Food Security in the Americas and Mexico seminar, Avocados, Honey, and Oilseeds, Stories from Mexican Fields and Beyond. I'm Gabriela Soto Laveaga, and I am a professor of the History of Science and Antonio Madero Professor for the Study of Mexico at Harvard University. Today, you are not only in for a treat, but you will likely think differently about some foods which many of us consume on a weekly basis. I co-organized the Mexico program with my colleague at the GSD, Diane Davis, who could not be with us today, but she sends her regards. Nearly 25 years ago, a group of then young scholars came together at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies in La Jolla to talk about Mexican commodities. We were all writing our dissertations on produced things, and we gathered to ponder if there was something new to say about Latin American commodities. Fortunately, there was. And the resulting book, The Social Relations of Mexican Commodities, Power, Production, and Place, examined how cotton, silver, wild yams, shrimp, and garbage continued to transform localities even after a commodity boom ended. How people and places in 20th century Mexico were tethered to histories of commodities and consequently defined by what they produced became an obvious theme of that collection. Less obvious was the shifting role of power in these spaces, a shift that could only be grasped by examining a longer history of the given commodity, for it was those subtle regional power struggles which placed such disparate commodities in conversation. Now, solidly in the 21st century, I am thrilled to see a new generation of exciting scholars building on older ideas, but also creating their own foundations to explain how commodities make and remake a space like Mexico. While today's talk focuses on a commodity, avocados, oilseeds, and honey, they are, however, richly complex studies of entangled regional and global relations. While their stories have clear echoes of all commodity studies, our climate change world and vulnerable food system networks today add new queries to their research. I will be introducing each of the speakers in turn. Our first speaker is Viridiana Hernández Fernández. Professor Hernández Fernández is a historian of modern Latin America, specializing in the 20th century environmental history of Mexico. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Iowa. Dr. Hernández received her PhD in history from the University of California, Davis in 2021. Her research interests focus on the many forms in which the transnational movement of people, food commodities, and agricultural technologies change rural landscapes in Latin America. She is currently working on her first book project, Guacamole Ecosystems. I love the title. Agriculture, Migration, and Deforestation in 20th century Mexico, that challenges the assumption that bureaucrats, scientists, and large-scale farmers were the primary actors in a long path of transformation of the Mexican countryside in the 20th century. Professor Hernández, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I would like to share my screen. Can you let me know if it is working? It is. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for the generous invitation to be part of this incredible panel. I am excited, beyond excited. Thank you all for being here as well. And well, as mentioned, I will talk about avocados. What previously was a forested region in the state of Michoacán is now the lucrative Mexican avocado belt. It is the largest avocado grower region in the world. Actually, this state grows a third of global avocado production every year. However, most growers in Michoacán are not big-scale farmers growing fruit in large states. They are an heterogeneous group of indigenous and non-indigenous campesinos who, in most cases, grow avocado in their communal lands or in small orchards of 2 to 5 hectares on average. I define campesinos, as historian Johnson Lurie does, in a literal sense, as people who grow food in the campo or the countryside. Nonetheless, in the mid-20th century, the Hass avocado was not even cultivated in this region. The present-day Mexican avocado belt was covered by pine tree forests that formed the Sierra Purépecha. So how come a group of campesinos shaped the largest avocado industry in just 5 decades? Let me tell you the story briefly. The avocado fruit is native to Mesoamerica, a cultural area that extends from central Mexico to Central America. In the first half of the 20th century, before the introduction of the Hass avocado, as easy as it was to spot avocado trees from native varieties to Michoacán, campesinos did not grow any fruit as a monoculture yet. People's commercial activities and daily practices in the Sierra Purépecha were related to the pine forests they called home. The Purépecha people had small sawmills to do the beams for their cabins, collected wood to light them, to keep them warm, and also do woodcrafts to sell in neighboring cities and towns. They also collected resin for the resin industry. But these landscapes and daily practices changed with the Hass avocado production. The Hass avocado was bred in the 1920s in California, a period when Californians were testing different plant breeding techniques with genetic plant material extracted from Latin American cultivars. In the late 1920s, a postman named Rudolf Hass crossbred avocado varieties from Guatemala and Mexico in his backyard. Hass stumbled upon a new variation when a graft from a Mexican variety failed, and the rootstock grew up in its place, eventually yielding the black-skinned fruit that we now may find everywhere. Due to its taste, size, shelf life, but most importantly, the large number of avocados yielded per tree, the Hass cultivar is the most commercial avocado worldwide in the present. This turn of events in suburban California would have a serious impact in rural Michoacán in the 1950s. Californian and Mexican farmers exchanged seedlings until the late 1950s, when Mexican growers introduced the California Hass variety to Michoacán. Hass avocados arrived to the Sierra Purépecha at a moment when the Mexican state was promoting large-scale agriculture in the country. The Ministry of Agriculture supported avocado commercial production in Michoacán by giving avocado trees for free to campesinos in the late 1950s. To take advantage of this opportunity, non-indigenous farmers and a mixed group of lawyers, bureaucrats, and physicians planted avocado trees in the Sierra Purépecha lands. Many campesinos then moved out of the Sierra or became laborers in the lands they rented to the emerging avocado farmers class. 20 years later, in the 1980s, campesinos from indigenous towns with communal lands began to grow the fruit too. Soon after, agrochemicals distributors, avocado nurseries, and packing houses sprouted all over the Purépecha lands, devouring the pine trees and eroding the fertile soils. Avocado production became so lucrative that the Mexican government that initially promoted the fruit's production prohibited converting forests into commercial orchards in 1992. The shifting policies of forest management had a high impact in Michoacán, though. Campesinos' economy had already shifted from subsistence agriculture and logging activities to large-scale production of Hass avocados. And this leads us to discuss the environmental changes that the production of avocado has created in Michoacán. Michoacán's prolific production of avocados is due to a combination of adequate edaphic and climatic conditions. From 1943 to 1952, the Paricutín, a volcano located in the heart of the avocado belt, completed its cycle of eruption. 9 years long Paricutín eruption released potassium to Michoacán's already deep, porous, and well-drained andosol soils that the Sierra Purépecha people called topure, which means dust. The potassium allows plants and any living thing on the earth to regulate water concentration, which is essential for the avocado tree's root system. Additionally, the hilly Sierra Purépecha has a temperate climate and a copious rainy season from June to October. Hill slopes allow an inexpensive constant flow of running water that helps the root system to thrive, as it is highly sensitive to moisture. So the hilly orography with deep and potassium-rich to poor soils, temperate weather, and abundant running water are all ideal conditions that allow Michoacán to grow avocados all year round. Nonetheless, favorable ecological conditions to grow a food product does not mean, of course, that monocultures are environmentally sustainable, particularly when they are grown in highly diverse ecosystems. Mexico's diversity is notable. There are more than 30 different ecosystems in the country, and Mexico is one of the 8 centers of domestication in the world. These centers are geographical areas where a group of organisms first developed their distinct characteristics or features, like the avocado in Mesoamerica. When homogeneous, high-yielding plant varieties are introduced in these centers of genetic diversity to be grown as a monoculture, the native cultivars are abandoned. The losses in genetic diversity in some places also result from the direct loss of plant life by clearing forests to cultivate monocultures, like in Michoacán. Avocado production also impacts local hydrological systems and global carbon dioxide sequestration. Avocado trees consume 4 to 5 times more water than Michoacán's native pine trees, jeopardizing water availability for human consumption in communities nearby. And they also sequester 4 times less carbon dioxide per hectare than pine native species. Therefore, environmentally speaking, growing Hass avocados every day of the year has involved a dramatic diversity loss, both by losing native avocado varieties and turning woodlands into agricultural units of production. It has also eroded the topore soils, threatened water resources for local communities, and reduced sequestration of carbon dioxide per hectare. Okay, what happened after refashioning of Purépecha forests into avocado orchards? When Michoacano growers intended to ship their fruit to the US in the 1990s, Californian agricultural cooperatives resisted Mexican imports by means of a quarantine imposed by the USDA in 1914 due to an alleged plague on the Mexican tree. Californians' lobbying was so effective that the prohibition to the entry of Mexican avocados was maintained even after the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect in 1994. Nonetheless, after 3 years of negotiations, a period that I call the Guacamole Wars, Mexico began to ship Hass avocados to this country for the first time in 1997. And here is when everything turns out to be more interesting. Californian agricultural cooperatives sagaciously adapted to the free trade era by going public in the early 2000s. These companies redirected their corporate strategies towards packing and shipping Mexican-grown avocados instead of growing them at home. In other words, they became the strongest competitors of those who they were supposed to represent, the avocado farmers in California. In less than 2 decades after NAFTA, it was clear that the guacamole wars were not between Mexican and US avocado growers, but between growers on both sides of the border and the corporate capital in the avocado industry. As of 2020, foreign companies like Alagua and Mission packed almost half of Michoacán's avocado shipped to the US. A more sustainable form of food production is urgent, but it can also be possible. As corporations will rely on environmentally unsustainable practices to keep producing as they are less expensive, it is up to civil society to demand regulations to protect local ecosystems and economies. By 2018, a few communities in the Sierra Purépecha were growing crops other than avocados for the international and domestic market, which give us all a ray of hope. As social ecosystems, diversity is the most effective way to restore flourishing natural ecosystems. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much, Professor Hernández, for that really fantastic talk and for sticking to time that I know how difficult it is to stay within 10 minutes. Moving right along, we are moving to another commodity, and we have next Angélica Márquez Osuna. Angélica is currently completing her dissertation on apiculture and the Apis mellifera in the Yucatan, Florida, and Cuba in the History of Science department at Harvard University. Angélica studies the history of Latin America from a global perspective, specializing in environment, race, labor, agriculture, and farming practices. She holds an MA degree in anthropological sciences from the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán, as well as a second MA in history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Angélica was awarded the Charles Hale Fellowship for Mexican History by the Latin American Studies Association earlier this year. Thank you so much, and Angélica, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm gonna share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
Looks great.
Okay.
Yes, you're good to go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction and organizing this fantastic panel about commodities in Mexico. Thank you so much, Gabriela and Mauricio, for this opportunity. I'm very excited about sharing this panel with my colleagues and amigo and amiga, Viridiana and Jayson Marie. The title of my presentation is Honey Production and the Agrarian Universe of Bees in Yucatan. So for this presentation, I will talk about honey, which I think is commonly considered more as a traditional product than an industrialized commodity. In my talk, I will show how the honey we consume and buy in the supermarket or the honey that is used as sweetener in other products such as cookies or granola bars is in fact a commodity highly industrialized. The material presented is based on my dissertation research titled Colonized Bees on the Tropical Frontier, Beekeeping and Modern Apiculture in Yucatan Peninsula, Cuba, and Florida from the 1760s to the 1940s. What I want to emphasize in this panel is that the honey produced in the Americas, as many other commodities such as sugar or coffee or chocolate, is intertwined with broader processes that characterize other tropical commodities, such as labor exploitation, environmental change, unequal power relationships between ethnic groups and societies, colonialism, and imperialism. Thus, what makes different honey from other commodities, and what can we learn while we try to analyze honey as a commodity? I think that we cannot understand a commodity as an isolated entity. As Karl Marx noted, a commodity depends on a social reality. Thus, in this case, what is the social reality in which honey is produced? What is the starting point of this commodity? Who produces honey? Well, the obvious answer is that honeybees are the producers of this commodity. But if we think more this question, we will realize that they do not produce such amount of honey just because they are naturally industrious insects. Honeybees are part of a domestication process or apiculture. I consider domestication as a function of human dominance, the human desire to nurture, and the agency and sociability of non-human animals, such as bees. I'm quoting Abel Alves. Thus, the human and bees relationship is what makes honey special in relation to other commodities. This social reality is what I call the agrarian universe of bees, or the entanglements in which bees are involved as productive organisms in terms of space and time. This is Apis mellifera, or the common honeybee we know for its honey production, but it is not native to the Americas. It is a European native that did not exist on the continent prior to the colonial period, as that it had been expanding across the New World due to human-assisted migrations since the beginning of colonization. It was not until the birth of modern apiculture that US beekeepers were able to move the species from Europe to northern regions of the United States in the mid-19th century. Beekeepers then rapidly spread honeybee south, first to Florida, then to Cuba in the late 19th century, and Mexico in the early 20th century. My research analyzes this trajectory. It looks at how and why, after 3 centuries of experimentation in the Americas, the honeybee came to be the most common bee on the continent, and what the consequences of its omnipresence are. Apiculture in tropical locations has been considered as a success story in agricultural studies. For example, apiculturists in the 20th century realized that honeybee is more productive in tropical environments than in the northern regions. Mexico is an example of this success and proliferation. Mexico is one of the top 5 honey producing countries in the world since the 20th century, and the Yucatan Peninsula is the most important region in the country. Modern hives of Apis mellifera were incorporated by beekeepers in rural landscapes in the 1910s in Mexico, with the support of the government that bought hives to a company in the United States. In 1930, Mexican beekeepers reported that there were 1.3 million hives in the country. There were no bee hives in the Yucatan Peninsula before this moment. Just to have an idea, currently there are 2.7 million honeybee colonies in the US and 2.1 million in Mexico. However, this story is more complicated if we consider the particularities of the agrarian universe of bees in Yucatan Peninsula. There is a complex and multi-layered history of honey production and the role of bees and humans in the shaping of ecosystem in this region. I argue that in the 20th century, beekeepers, entomologists, and apiculturists relocated honeybees to environments that were already rich in bee biodiversity. This was the case in Yucatan, where Maya communities had developed the most sophisticated bee husbandry system and honey and wax trading networks in Mesoamerica, with the stingless bee Melipona vici, which has been bred in the region over 3,000 years. Instead of assuming that Mayan beekeeping was substituted by apiculture, I emphasize that local knowledge persisted through the centuries, resisting colonialism, capitalism, and Western science. Archives show that Maya community continued to be the primary beekeepers in New Spain during the Spanish colonial rule in the 16th century. Moreover, beekeepers with Melipona remained an important activity in the 19th century. This is a map with the distribution of beehives of Melipona in 1878 in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this occurred before apiculturists brought modern hives of Apis mellifera from the US and introduced them in rural Yucatan in the 20th century. By the end of the 1930s, apiculture was considered the best rural business in Yucatan. Let me underline this. In less than 2 decades, the honeybee became part of the environment and landscape of Yucatan. This is a map created by the Mexican government where we can have an idea about the honeybee distribution. It's a current map in the Yucatan Peninsula. In the last years, there has been an increasing concern from the declining population of pollinators. For example, we all are familiar with one of the most global conservation and environmental campaigns, Save the Bees. While experts agree that honeybees are crucial in commercial agriculture and the economy, keeping only honeybees is not wildlife conservation. We all recognize the first honeycomb that you can see in the screen, the geometrical cells created by the honeybee. However, what you see in the right side is a Melipona vici honeycomb. Why we only recognize the comb of one kind of honeybee, even if in regions such as Yucatan, there is the presence and persistence of other native bees, we are not familiar with the second hive, right? This reminds what Ricardo Bullet observed when he explained that we are entering in a new era of human-animals relations or post-domesticity. We have distanced ourselves from constant interaction with many different species of other animals. In my research, I underlined that honeybees were implemented in locations that were rich in bee biodiversity. In the Yucatan Peninsula, there are 70 species of stingless bees. Only Melipona has been used for domestic hives. These hives have been kept in solares, huertas, or gardens in Maya communities. We can see how the agrarian universe of bees is one of the multi-species and much more complex than our bias and ideas of modernizations of rural landscapes. While the government and agriculture companies deployed a discourse that dismissed the role of native bees in the new industrial agriculture system and depicted Maya beekeeping as a backward practice in the 20th century, something different occurred in the localities. One of the outcomes of my dissertation research is that beekeepers in the Yucatan Peninsula, whether Maya, Yucatecans, or Mestizos, became active agents of environmental change by experimenting, innovating, and breeding new species of honeybees with the modern method of apiculture and rely on their knowledge about weather, flora, seasons, and bees. Again, instead of assuming that Maya beekeeping was substituted by apiculture, I emphasize that this human-bee relationship based on modernization and technification of agriculture shaped not only a new environment with different bees, the Apis mellifera, but the human-bee relationship. Thus, what I have discovered is that in the 20th century, a new agrarian identity in the region was shaped, the apiculturist, which did not exist before the 20th century in Mexico. There is the idea that since the mid-20th century, beekeeping with Melipona bee in Yucatan disappeared. However, in the 20th century, the biology of Melipona allowed local beekeepers and apiculturists themselves to continue with the practice of beekeeping with Melipona bee in their patios, their honey has been used for healing purposes, rituals, and as part of the domestic environment in pueblos. Yes, there was a decrease in Melipona bee population with the industrialization of apiculture, but this is an ongoing story. And since 10 or 15 years ago, there is a revival of beekeeping with Melipona. Thus, what started with the simple question of what constitutes the social reality of a commodity, in this case honey, allow us to discover the multi-layered ecosystem in which humans and bees are deeply entangled. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angélica, for a really wonderful presentation. We are going on next to our final speaker, and I want to remind you that you can be putting your questions in the Q&A section at any time during today's conversation. Our next and final speaker is Jayson Maurice Porter. Jayson Maurice Porter is a Voss postdoctoral research associate at the Institute at Brown University for Environment and Society, or IBIS. His research specializes in food systems, environmental politics, science and technology studies, and racial ecologies in Mexico and the Americas. Jayson is an editorial board member of the North American Congress for Latin America, NACLA, a staff blogger for Black Perspectives, and an environmental specialist for Noria's Research Mexico and Central America program. You can find his research in Environmental Humanities, Environment and Society, Advances in Research, The Washington Post, and the Organic Center. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jayson Maurice.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Gabriela, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen really quickly, so hopefully everybody can see. Can everybody see okay?
Looks great.
Awesome, thank you. I would also like to thank Mauricio for the facilitation, and then my two lovely co-panelists for their presentation. And lastly, just because of the ongoing incidents that's going on right now at the University of Virginia, I like to send my thoughts out to them. Also, thoughts to the 48,000 graduate students striking at University of California system this week. Power to them. Okay, so pleasure to be here to bring this panel home. I'm gonna try to be quick because I'm usually really long-winded. So if you can see the screen, today I'm gonna talk about coconuts And I've titled this presentation, Another Visible Hand, and that is a reference to a book by Alfred Chandler that came out in 1977 called The Visible Hand, where he argues that in addition to the market, this kind of invisible hand that shapes capitalism, there's actually materials, there's management, there are people, individuals, and there's politics that shape capitalism. And I argue in this that another form of the material culture that shapes capitalism is the palm tree, which is also gets its name because it resembles an arm and a palm. And in addition to that, I also want to add to the material culture the labor as well. So I'm going to focus mostly on race and labor in this presentation, but I look forward to more questions as we go forward. So, just to show you this image here in the very beginning is a presentation of all the different materials, all the different industrial products that came from not just coconut, the oil seed itself, but the entire palm tree in the 1940s. So similar to what we think about today, like high fructose corn syrup, a highly industrialized product from a material that we hardly can eat that goes into thousands of different products in the post-NAFTA era. I try to think about how oil seeds, in particular coconuts and sesame grown in Guerrero, Mexico, create a very similar form of economic exchange that renders both a material fungible and interchangeable, as well as the people and places that are involved in its production. Okay. So really quickly, a roadmap, and as you see on this picture here, coconut palms are used as actual speed bumps in this part of Costa Chica and Guerrero where I was doing research. I'm going to start off with a little bit about my interventions. I'll talk a little bit about related works, and then I'm going to jump into some historical background. Really, I'm just going to show you some pictures. Honestly, they're not as beautifully arranged as the two panelists before, but I'll do my best to describe them, and then I'll kind of end with a case study that brings us to the post-revolutionary period. And we'll talk about why kind of labor movements around coconuts matter, not just in the past, but matter today still. Okay, so interventions. I'm going to read these out loud for you. So on visibility, so I have 3 themes and 3 interventions. So tracing the impact of technology and science on market dynamics through soap industry. This helps us see industrialization and globalization in Mexican agriculture at a much earlier phase. An example of this is that Mexico and its soap industry, which is using coconuts, is actually an importer of coconuts from the Philippines from 1898, when the United States creates its colonial relationship with the Philippines after the U.S.-Spanish War, to World War II, excuse me, because the day after Pearl Harbor, Japan actually went into the Philippines and destroyed one of the most important industrial products for warfare for the United States during World War II. A lot of the gas masks we used, the husks that were used for the insulation, actually came from coconut husks. A lot of the saline, when we ran out of saline solution for soldiers, they used coconut water, and hundreds of different products from soap to processed foods went into the bellies and cleaned soldiers in the war. So kind of that's an example of kind of thinking about the Mexico's kind of role in early industrialization and globalization before Green Revolution. Similar to that, this is also kind of seeing the state like a community. And so as opposed to seeing a community like a state, seeing the state's actions and its participation in this political economy as something that brings different forms of economic violence into communities, both direct violence, actual environmental change and degradation, but also economic insecurity. And then lastly, similar to Claudia Leal, I use a commodity as an angle to better understanding an agrarian and agricultural history of an Afro-descendant population. Oilseeds like coconuts and sesame help us see, sorry, I just jumped through a whole bunch of stuff, y'all, my bad. Let me go back, okay. Help us see Afro-descendant communities where we do not have as many materials, and also help to see the violence that they experience, but also the refuge that they forged in response to that. Okay, some related works that I'm in conversation with. In 1978, there was a book called Aceites, Jabones, and Multinacionales that really focuses on Costa Grande and Guerrero and shows how important it was as the major raw material producer for some of the largest multinational companies in the world. Another important work that came out a year earlier also focused on Costa Grande and talks about how the coconut growers in that space were really important in forging some of the political moves that came very central in the dirty wars or some of the guerrilla wars in Guerrero during the 1970s. So I'm kind of adding on to those and kind of showing that it wasn't just Costa Grande and it wasn't just this period in the 1960s and 1970s in the context of the Cold War and in the context of the Green Revolution, but it was also Costa Chica and Costa Grande. It was beyond just the mestizo population, but also included the indigenous and Afro-Indigenous populations. And it also started in the wake of the revolution, not just in the wake of the Green Revolution. Okay, so just really quickly to show you on a map. So I'm actually talking about the state right next to the state that Professor Hernández talked about, Michoacán. This is the state of Guerrero. And I'm talking about the entire coast from Costa Grande on the western side to Costa Chica on the eastern side. And Costa Chica on the eastern side is known as having the largest self-identifying Afro-Indigenous population in the country. And what I think is really interesting is that you can track 600 years of communities in this region through oilseeds. The Amuzco and the Mixtec and the Zapotec populations in the pre-colonial period paid tribute to the Aztecs through cacao. Spanish used enslaved indigenous people and enslaved African people to create cacao plantations. After that, in the 18th and 19th century, there were cotton plantations. And that's where I pick up with the development of coconut and sesame plantations that developed after that. This map was created by a good friend of mine who actually is at the University of Virginia right now, which is why I had to mention them earlier. And thank you, Alicia, for her work on this. And I hope she is still safe with her family. This is a picture to kind of show you how Afro-Indigeneity factors into this. You can almost imagine the gaze of the white biologist who told these women to stand here and face this way. But this picture was taken by National Geographic in 1904 of what they called half Black, half Indian women who were gathering palm kernels to be taken to a soap factory that was created in Acapulco by US investors in 1895. And 10 years later, they actually started changing all of this kind of foraged palm kind of landscape into actual coconut plantations, developing about 100,000 coconut plantations right before the Mexican Revolution, which those plantations actually became fodder for agrarian reform, where communities actually requested those plantations for themselves, not to replace this industry, but to replace the power brokers who were in control of this industry. This is a picture of an Afro-descendiente community, not in Costa Chica, but actually in Costa Grande, drying their coconuts out on the floor before the invention of drying centers came and started to displace this practice. This is another picture. This is taken in Costa Chica. This is not coconuts. This is ajonjolí or sesame. A lot of people think of sesame as something that's grown was domesticated in Africa, but it was grown in South Asia, East Asia. But the largest producer in this hemisphere is actually Guerrero. So Guerrero is the largest producer of both sesame and coconuts. So this is another picture. And then lastly, and this kind of this will get me into my final case study, which I'll be very brief about, this is a picture taken in Costa Grande of an old cotton factory that used to create textiles in the 19th century that was transformed into an industrial space for coconuts. And if you can see the ejido in the foreground, or the collective land that's owned by a community, which I'll talk about the community in a second, and the coconut plantations that are in the background. So in 1926, a group by the name of the Viralistas, led by a man named Amadeo Virales, came and tried to destroy this factory, largely because Spanish owners still controlled most of the political economy for oilseeds in the wake of the revolution. And a lot of of merchants and farmers invested in this political economy wanted to usurp Spanish control. So the Vitalistas movement takes place between 1926 and 1929, and they take over the soap industry, they take over coconut plantations, and in 1929, they're actually granted a coconut plantation. All right. And what I think is really important about this coconut plantation that they form is it becomes a center of agrarian reform and agrarian movements of ambos coastas, a union of both coasts throughout the 1930s during the height of agrarian reform in Mexico. And starting in the 1940s, it became a center of agrarian reform and agrarian struggle throughout the later part of the 20th century as farmers got less and less, had fewer and fewer benefits from growing oil seeds for the soap and vegetable industry. And actually some of the largest social movements in Guerrero, the Partido de los Pobres, led by Lucio Cabañas, actually started, his uncles were Vitalistas 60 years earlier, and it kind of creates this kind of wave of struggle around oil seeds. And I look forward to answering some more of the questions as I move forward. But the last thing I'll end is with this quote from Procter & Gamble in 1931. It says, "The process of washing is largely a process of coating the body with a solution which is strong enough to take off dirt, but strong enough to take off, but not strong enough to take off skin." And I argue that the soap industry is largely a process that creates a solution that's both strong enough to remove dirt and skin, referring to both people and place. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jayson Maurice, for that also wonderful presentation. So what we do now is I will ask a couple of questions of the panelists to start our conversation, and then we will open it up to questions. I see that there are many questions in the Q&A. So you will each have about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes to respond to this larger question, just so we can move on to our conversation on to the questions. The first one I wanted to ask you about, you are each speaking about very specific Mexican regions or states, Michoacán, Yucatán, Guerrero, and very specific racial and ethnic groups. We have Afrodescendientes, we have Maya, we have campesinos, indigenous campesinos in Michoacán. But it's also about the transformation of these communities and the transformation of ecosystems because of global demand for the products. Each of your ecosystems are different, from forests, tropical jungles, arid lands. Can you expand on the environmental consequences of concerted state and federal projects to focus on these 20th and 21st century commodities? And how about if we begin with you, Professor Hernández?
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much. That is a wonderful question. Well, as I was mentioning, the region that grows avocado in Michoacán is not the whole state. It's just a belt that crosses the state from east to west. However, this area was the Sierra Purépecha, still is the Meseta Purépecha, and it was a forested region. It was a forest of pine trees, and approximately, recent studies have shown that the area that has been deforested because of the avocado production is about the same size as the island of Hawaii. That is like a large proportion of the forest in Michoacán. But it's not only that, it also created different economic arrangements and social relations in this area, since everything before the avocado boom revolved around the forests. There was already logging and deforestation activities, and it's related to one of the top of the questions that I have been reading in the Q&A. Wonderful questions, all of them, by the way. But those moderate logging activities that were, moderate is like a word that we should have like a consideration of it, but logging activities that began since the Porfiriato in the late 19th century accelerated because of the production of these avocado, this commodity, this food commodity. And it completely rearranged the local relations of power and social economic relations in the region. So it's not only about the environmental consequences. The water resources available in this region has also been depleted, almost depleted, and the erosion of the soils have been increasing, even though we are talking about a very nutritious, porous, productive soils composition. It has been decreased and eroded. So there are many different effects. However, the one that I consider is the most relevant is the loss in diversity. Not only of other avocado types, but also the plant life, animal life that was directly connected to the forests that had been depleted because of the production of a monoculture. So I think the loss of diversity in terms of the avocado varieties, but also the animal and plant life that was there before the boom of the avocado production, it's, in my opinion, the biggest environmental concern.
Thank you so much. Angélica, why don't we follow up with you?
Great. Thank you so much for a wonderful question. And your point, Viridiana, is just amazing. Well, the consequences are similar, as Viridiana said. It's about so beekeeping with only one kind of honeybee, of course, can impact in biodiversity. Not only in terms of Melipona, which also produces honey, but also in terms of other pollinators. And actually, I have an example, a living example here, which is this vanilla plant, which is only pollinated by a Melipona, a native Melipona from this part of Yucatan. And so, of course, with all these projects, and I think that is, so of course, honey is the product, the commodity that I'm talking about. But what is more interesting to see is the relations of this commodity honey with other elements that are important for the ecosystem. In this case, for example, vanilla. When you make the connection between honey and vanilla, you don't think that there is this clear idea. But if we think about the aspect of biodiversity and the importance of native pollinators, you will have this idea of the complexity that just beekeeping with honeybee, Apis mellifera, changed throughout the time in the last century. Yes, that's the main point that I see regarding the question.
Thank you so much, Angélica. That's a really great point. And Jayson, Maurice?
Yeah, I will. I'm gonna hit it. I'm gonna step outside of coconuts and I'm gonna hit on something that touches Michoacán, Yucatan, and Guerrero. So thinking about seasonal dry tropical forests, which are the world's most endangered type of tropical forests in the world. Yet we know so little about them because we always think about rainforest when we think about tropical forests, right? So I think about 67%, so this is about the Americas, so I'll start with the Americas. So 67% I think of the world's seasonal dry tropical forests are in the Americas. And 12.5 of the world's seasonal dry tropical forests are in Mexico. All of them, right? But most of them today, about half of them in Mexico don't actually resemble forests. Between 1980 and 1997, so largely before NAFTA, Mexico lost about 2% of its seasonal dry tropical forests every year, okay? And this is largely because seasonal dry tropical forests are more conducive to industrial agriculture. They're more conducive to human development and cattle, largely because they have more fertile land, they have less biomass you have to remove, they have seasonality that's more conducive to like short-term crop cycles. And so Mexico at this moment, even though it's comprised of, has some of the largest densities of seasonal dry tropical forests, but to Vari's point, are some of the most diverse forests in the world, right? We literally do not have them. They are literally resemble plantations today. Right. So I think that's kind of, something that kind of connects our projects and kind of connects kind of the environmental changes that Mexico is, because of its role in producing so many commodities around the world in its seasonal dry tropical forest, many of them do not exist anymore, which adds to issues of erosion, adds to issues of water contamination, adds to issues of soil fertility, adds to issues of air quality. So the list goes on, but I think that that's something that I think it's just an interesting point that all three of our commodities are largely coming from places that have prolonged dry seasons, which shapes the processes of the commodity production too, which we can get into later. But I think that's a major example of the kind of environmental change.
Thank you, each of you, for pointing out some really specific issues with your particular regions. I'm going to actually turn to the Q&A because we have 11 questions and we have about 20 minutes left. So let's turn to those. The first one I'm seeing right now is from a colleague, David Pratel. And he's, thanking you for your fascinating presentations. He says, I have a question for all three speakers. It is clear that your research fills gaps in the history of Mexico. But do your cases change our perspective on big research questions in the history of global commodities and how they should be researched? If so, which ones and how? So we'll start this time with Jayson Maurice and work our way to Viridiana.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I don't know if I'd be remiss to say it changes how we ask these questions, but I do think that thinking about the raw materials necessary for early industrial products helps us think about long histories of like fungibility and how people and places and plants are rendered exchangeable, both on the market and in our value systems. So I think that label on many products that we have that says this may contain cottonseed or sesame or coconut, I think we can study that as a label that speaks to violence, right? That speaks to the fact that the commodity or the brand, it has the technology to basically simplify the botanical and biological differences between cottonseed and sesame and coconut and render the triglycerides and the proteins that it needs for any given product or any given process, right? And I think that that's a way that we can see how communities are put into competition, how they're kind of erased and are kind of invisible when we kind of think about these larger global commodity change and how they move, right? And how they move. Thank you so much for that question, Dave.
Thank you, Angélica.
Yes, thank you so much for this amazing question. Yeah, well, I think that one of the big questions that I've been thinking about in the last months is precisely about the, when we're thinking about these commodities, we sometimes dismiss the aspect of the biological component, for example, in this case, domestication, the meaning of domestication. Right. So for that reason, for my research, I found that thinking about the specific relationship between the producer, right, and the people in this case, or the beekeeper in this case, is a very productive way of analyzing this commodity. Rather than thinking about, for example, the chemical components or the process of pasteurization of honey, for example, thinking about the very beginning of this process is important. And also the connections, the transnational connections that are embedded in this kind of commodities. We don't think that honeybees themselves could be seen as a commodities that are traveling from the US, that were bought in the 20th century by the government, right, to produce a different commodity. That kind of chains are some of the big questions that I want to answer.
Thank you so much for that, and for really thinking of bees as themselves as commodities. That's a really interesting thought. Viridiana?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I second what was already mentioned, but I think probably it's obvious based on this panel, but I think the biggest concern here is the environmental change. But it's not only environmental change per se, but in a moment of great acceleration. We are dealing with fast-paced environmental changes, fast-paced ecologies and local context changing like very rapidly. It's associated, as Jayson Maurice mentioned, with violence, but it's also connected with the second element mentioned by Angélica, the transnationality of these studies, which is not new. Food commodities have been studied for Latin American historiography long time ago as production sites and consumption parts in the world. However, what I think we are experiencing now is what could be called like translocality, particular places where something is produced to be consumed in particular spaces that also are growing that commodity, but they aren't the biggest consumers of that commodity at the same time. So I think that those elements, like very specific regions of the world connected fast, very fast, things moving really fast by process of economic change, violence use, and increase environmental reformation, reshaping, refashioning of places, I think pose different set of questions. Also, we are also dealing with a different kit of tools and sources, not only sources, because even if we, for instance, I know Angélica is working with sources that are probably from the colonial period, but the tools that we now have, the possibility that to show the map that Jayson Maurice showed in his presentation, and the possibility of sea change through time by different technologies also brings us different questions, because now we can be more creative.
Thank you so much for this idea of translocality, which I think is essential to really understand not just the moment in which these commodities are being made, but the impact that they will have well beyond the borders of where these commodities are produced. Moving, and there was a question, yes, the recording will be available, and we will put that on the Dr. Class website. So there was a question about cartels in Michoacán and avocados, because this has obviously been a lot in the news, but I wanted to expand that great question a bit to ask it of all of you. What type of violences do you see on the ground that are directly linked or directly impact the commodity that you are studying? So I will begin with you, Angélica, and then we'll turn to Viri and Jayson Maurice.
Thank you so much for such wonderful question. Yeah, violence on the ground. Well, the first violence that I see is regarding with there is this problem that is happening right now in the southeast region. For example, with the creation of infrastructures that impact the agrarian system that is used not only for the market of commodities, like for example in this case industrialized honey, but what is happening with the local access of agricultural systems or the parcelas. For example, I'm just referring, for example, to the Tren Maya, which are this kind of a modernization projects that are installed in localities with the idea of that they are changing the infrastructure, and they will connect this region to another region, right? But the impact that has on the localities and the places and the land that they need for producing in the parcelas is one of the big. So I think land tenure is important, and through the infrastructure projects implemented by the state. Yeah, that is one of the violences that I see in my case.
So the violence of land tenure and
Land tenure.
obtaining land, very interesting. Viridiana, I think it was Viridiana and then Jayson Maurice, was that correct? Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. I actually prepared a slide. Can I share my?
Yes, please.
Thank you. But this is I think it is a very important question, and I would like to, oh, wait a second. I'm so sorry. Let me know. Is it working now?
We don't see it now, but would you like to try it again?
Okay, I think I will.
There we go.
Okay, good. Well, I prepared this slide because I think it is an important question. It is crucial when we are talking about Michoacán, and it's the same case as I'm sure Jayson will agree with me. It's the same case for Gabriela as well. So I don't think that drug violence can be explained because of the avocado production. It's not because of the avocado production that we have the presence of these drug cartels in Michoacán. I think we all can agree with that. However, criminal organizations have kept Michoacán in constant agitation since the 2010s. And although avocado production itself would hardly explain the violence, of course, is related to the increase of the levels of violence in the state. But I love this question because it gives me the best opportunity to emphasize how history can be important as a discipline on the ground. Because if we take a look to the archives and to the history of this region in Michoacán, we can see that post-revolutionary administrations that goes from 1910 to 1992 created created sophisticated orders by which the agrarian leaders became co-managers of the violence, of the use of violence in the state. When those leaders lost the relevance of the social power they had, when the ejido began to break after the constitutional reform in 1992, the strong man's use of violence to advance communal interests delegitimized. And then those gaps began to be filled by different violent or criminal organizations as well, of leaders. Drug economies, it's also been proven by, I can't remember her last name right now, it's researcher Colunga, apologize, I will find her last name soon. But drug economies expand with other illicit trades because they have created the networks for moving commodities. They follow the networks for moving commodities that have been already created in those places. So local networks of corruption allow this movement of illicit or illegal commodities to move following pretty much the same networks. The war on drugs that began or increased violence in Mexico after the Merida Initiative in 2007-08. A second effect that created is that gave deadlier weapons to these criminal organizations, to these criminal cells. And within the context of neoliberal globalization, export-driven illegal commodities diversify their operations to increase profit, just as legal corporations and legal companies do. So they are not only investing in drug trafficking, but they use other forms of violence in order to obtain an economic gain. And of course, this translates as an increase of violence in this region. However, if we go to the archives, I must insist that the production of avocado would not explain by itself the cartel's activity in Michoacán. It only created different forms of uses of violence. And if I may have just a couple of seconds, because I read another question of another person who is really concerned about avocado consumption. Don't stop eating avocados. Now the local economies have shifted towards these food commodities. If we stop consuming those commodities, at least for the case in Michoacán, suddenly overnight, many people, many campesinos, many families will be out of an income. The other question is what can we do then as consumers? We can demand for law enforcement, different regulations, forcing companies and estates to create regulations that protect local environments and economies. That in Michoacan, in my case, as I have seen, and this is my belief, is encouraging and creating spaces for production for different markets, not only for one specific market and for the market, the international market of avocado production, but there are some communities in Michoacan that are growing other food, other crops for domestic market as well. And diversity is important if we're trying to recover the sustainability in these spaces. Sorry, that was a large intervention.
But I really appreciate it. It really put into context the specific meaning of violence in each of these regions. And thank you for adding to that second response. And Jayson Maurice, could you address violence and Guerrero and your commodity?
One, I have to acknowledge how beautiful an explanation that was. So thank you, Betty. That was great. Start drawing a little further back, though. I think so. One of the first thing I see, which you see all over Mexico, are the development of guardias blancas, or white guards, right? So as soon as these kind of socialist-inspired and Zapatista-inspired communities got hold of some of these coconuts at the rise of coconut demand, you know, you had the rise of these white guards, which were formed by kind of upset landowners who lost coconuts, but also a lot of smallholders who weren't enveloped into the ejido system. So I'd love to talk to more about kind of the earlier definition that she gave about campesinos, because in Guerrero, it really matters whether or not you're a landless farmer, an ejidatario, or a smallholder or a hacendado. So largely these guardias blancas actually started hoarding oil seeds. So it's interesting, oil seeds aren't strawberries or bananas or avocados. They don't need to be rushed to the market. You can hold them and hoard them until the market comes to you. And this is why, in many regards, some of these guardias blancas, especially in Guerrero, and even more so in Sinaloa, where I look in my dissertation in Sesame, these guardia blancas actually started hiring hitmen to control opium production, and they actually became some of the first organized crime around kind of the early cartels. So guardias blancas were organized criminals. They organized together and they terrorized farmers, and they figured out ways to control the markets at their benefit at the expense of the local farmers. And they became, in many places, especially Sinaloa and Guerrero, some of the earliest organized crime, even before some of the beautiful changes that Professor Hernández laid out, in the 1990s, right? And earlier. So I think that's one really, really important thing. And that's why Guerrero, in many regards, I said you can track 600 years of oilseed production, from cacao to coconuts. But starting in the 1960s, Acapulco Gold becomes one of the first globally understood oilseeds, an illicit oilseed that's grown in the coasts. So opium ends up growing very, very well in some of the slippery slopes that sesame grows in. So you could track that 600-year history even further into the history of illicit oil seeds. But I don't think you can really separate organized crime that was terrorizing farmers and the type of organized crime that develops in the 60s and 70s that continues to wage war against poor farmers.
Thank you so much for that answer, and really linking the levels of violence that we tend to disassociate as if they were different violences and not violences built on top of each other in the longer history. So seeing the time and that we only have 5 minutes, I'm going to actually put together several questions that we have in the chat, but are asking similar questions, such as one from Diana Mendez and Caitlin Lampson. And what they're asking is about the tensions that we have between preserving nature, nationalizing nature, and preserving these national spaces, and disputes that are happening for differentiated use of territory. Or as Caitlin Lampson adds to her question, how important will it be for restoration ecologists to become restoration economists? And how do you see that tension playing out on the ground in the spaces that you're looking at? And how about if we go back to you as a starting point, Viridiana?
Yeah. Great questions. Thank you so much. It has given me a lot to think about. Well, as Jayson was mentioning, there are different forms of land use and land ownership in Michoacan. There are campesinos, indigenous peasants, there are private landowners, there are corporate estates, like corporate avocado orchards. So it's different. The way that people connect to the land and the way that people use land has effects on the economy and in the ecosystem, both sides. So I think it is very important, this question. What I have seen is the fracture of the ejido, the sudden fracture of the ejido in Michoacan because of the production of one commodity doesn't erase the way, the social connections that the ejido created. On the contrary, I think it has, we haven't found a form, in my opinion, to readjust the way that we produce to the ejido form that there are many ejidatarios in Michoacan, and they are doing incredible work producing a food commodity that is not created in terms of land ownership to be grown as legitimizing their position as ejidatarios. So I think one of the most important thing in the case of Michoacan is to try to give the strength back to the ejido, to try to recover the political and social relevance that the ejido had within a new framework. It's not like, because what I have seen is that sometimes, especially policymakers, tend to see the ejido as a cultural ancient, changeless form of using land, and that is not the case. And ejidatarios, in my opinion, I would love to hear what Angélica and Jayson thoughts are on this. Ejidatarios are economic agents, like we all are, and they just own the land as an ejido form. So my biggest concern here in terms of the relationship with land and land use in Michoacan would be to find, to create new outlets for the ejido to be engaged in a sustainable form of production. And yeah, that would be, sorry.
So I think Angélica and Jayson Maurice, you each have 2 minutes if you can, because we're out of time, but I would really love to hear from each of you. Angélica?
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks so much for that wonderful explanation about the ejido, Viridiana. And yeah, so I was thinking about the aspect of ejido and the different form of land use and attachment to land. I was thinking about an interview that I conducted a few years ago in a pueblo here in Yucatan, in Sucafab. And I remember that I was asking to a beekeeper who is also Maya Hablante and also an ejidatario. We were talking about this. And he owned this like large parcel of for honey production, but also for cows and also for cultivating oranges. And he told me, you know, what it makes different bees is that they don't know about borders. They can go and they can cross the next ejido, or they can go to another part in which they are using fertilizers that I can control in my ejido. So that is what makes different honeybees from other relationship that I have with nature and the land. And I think that yeah, so I think that being more open to what people is considering land and the challenges that they have in the daily life when they are working are crucial for understanding this problem, right? Beyond our ideas of the meaning of ejido, right? Beyond our ideas of the Anthropocene, what are the questions that people have while they are working their own land? Yeah, that's it. I know that I don't have.
Thank you so much for that. So building on Viridiana's point of reframing the ejido using a new conceptualization, and Angélica putting forth this notion that bees do not respect borders as other domestic animals are enclosed. And we leave that in these final 2 minutes to you, Jayson Maurice.
Yikes. It's hard to finish after such lovely points, but you know, I think me personally, there's some serious limits to the type of perspective I can give on a question that speaks to land use right now in the 21st century. As a historian, especially that my work stops in the 70s, I don't have a close relationship with ejidatarios today. I do know people who own coconuts, but I don't feel comfortable speaking for what that needs to happen. So to the points that were just said, I think there are over 29,000 ejidos in Mexico that control about 43% of arable land. Mm-hmm. So to that, I think that patience and humility and a diversity, not just biologically speaking, but in terms of perspective really matters going forward. And in terms of what I would say the restoration ecologist or economist is that you're just going to need to question the things you think work well, you know, question all the, you know, and not to put too many eggs in a basket, you know. I think one of the things that we all deal with in monocultures, and to quote a professor, Amelia Leguizamon, I butchered that last name, I'm so sorry, but she talks about how monocultures in many ways are oversimplified environments. They're simplified because of patriarchy. They're simplified because of capitalism. They're simplified because of ethnocentrism. And in many ways, these are spaces where fewer decisions were allowed to decide what happens to land. And this is what everyone here is talking about, right? The decisions that are being able to make. And I don't think that I have a perspective that matters in this question, but I do think I could use this moment to say that in the 29,000+ ejidos, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made about what happens with land. And we for too long let these one crops and these single economies and these single multinationals and brands and marcas control the decisions that are made. And even at the ejido level, one of the biggest things that needs to happen in the restructuring of them is how women fit into them, because they are patriarchy by design, and they in many ways undermine a breadth and diverse thinking and decision-making of what happens with land and for whom.
What a powerful way to end this conversation, Jayson Maurice, by reminding us of the oversimplification that comes with monoculture, but also bringing in the gender question, which we didn't have time to speak about, and what that means when we talk about commodities and gender. So I feel that we must continue our conversation at another time. And I'd like to urge our visitors and our listeners to tune in to the website. We will be having more food security in the Americas and more talks on Mexico as part of the Mexico program. But for today, please join me in welcoming Professor Hernández, postdoctoral fellow Jayson Maurice, and dissertator Angélica Márquez Osuna in presenting with us a new vision, a new narrative of Mexican commodities in the 20th and 21st century. Thank you so much and have a great day.